Welcome to another in our series of Kehillat Israel podcasts. This is a recording of Rabbi Amy Bernstein's weekly Friday morning Torah study.
This is a story most of you know, right? Most of you know at least the outlines of this story. So this morning, it is a wonderful thing to be studying about the first case of civil disobedience against an unjust and corrupt regime. So overlords, exactly. It's just what's here, people. It's just what's here. I'm just teaching what's here. So let us begin Exodus chapter 1, verse 1, which does not begin with talking about the people enslaved, right? So that is not where Shemot begins. Let's see where it does begin.
These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each coming with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah; Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin; Dan and Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. The total number of persons that were of Jacob's issue came to 70. Jacob being already in Egypt. Joseph being already in Egypt. Joseph died, and all his brothers and all that generation. But the Israelites were fertile and prolific. They multiplied and increased very greatly, so that the land was filled with them. A new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are much too numerous for us. Let us deal shrewdly with them so that they may not increase. Otherwise, in the event of war, they may join our enemies in fighting against us and rise from the ground." So they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built garrison cities for Pharaoh, Pithom and Ramesses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they increased and spread out, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites.
Okay. We have the 70, right? A number of completion, right? In Torah, whenever we see 70, this is a number of fullness, a number of completion. So 70 people, of course, make up the household of Yaakov, who went down to Egypt. Yosef, of course, is the vizier of Egypt. He is second in power only to Paro. But it's, quick. We're getting a very quick recap, because by verse 8, we get a new king arose over Egypt, probably a new monarchy, right? Not just a new king, not just a new pharaoh, a new dynasty. So scholars try to figure out which dynasty this is. Some feel like they have it figured out, like my notes tell me when this is, but most scholars agree it's very hard to pinpoint what pharaoh this is, to identify the cities of Pithom and Ramses. It's very difficult to pinpoint what time this is even trying to talk about. Although, like I said, the scholars like Sarna, who did the commentary for JPS Exodus, puts it at Ramses II, the 19th dynasty in Egypt, about 1290 BCE. So, in either case, a new dynasty begins that does not recognize Joseph. This is the first time we get the word yada in Exodus, right? The word to know. And what does the Torah always mean when it talks about to know?
What is that, right?
So often the Torah means sex. In this case, it's not that they did not have sex with Joseph. So yada, to know, is always an intimate knowledge. It's not about, oh, I knew that, right? It's not knowing facts. It's a knowing that is deeper. And so in this case, not knowing Joseph means it's not they didn't know his name, right? Or they'd never heard of him. It meant whoever this new dynasty is not aware. It has put Joseph and all that he stood for and his relatives out of the picture, right?
And he has two separate verbs for to know a fact and to really be familiar with something. To know.
French is the same.
Yeah.
One kind of means, in French, one means to kind of know somebody, to be acquainted with them.
Right.
And another one means knowledge in terms of depth.
Those distinctions are clear in all the English.
Right. So other languages seem to preserve like this idea that you kind of know something off the top of your head, and then you really know something. And so Torah has that distinction. Yes.
Does this imply that many generations have passed?
It might or might not. It might be that the new dynasty kicks Joseph out, right? In terms of, like it's a new regime, right? And
Like what we're experiencing.
so that leaves Joseph's people vulnerable. Because remember, they are not Egyptian, right? They've come down, they are settled in Goshen, and they've come down. Why are they in Egypt? Because of the famine. And we know from the historical record that people in Canaan would push down into Egypt when there was a famine. Why was there food in Egypt if there wasn't food in Canaan?
Joseph saved them.
Well, Joseph put some away. The Nile River, right? So Egypt is its irrigation is by the Nile. In Canaan, what is it dependent on? Rainfall. So often there was food in Egypt when there wasn't food in Canaan. Not always. It depends what the crop failure was caused by. But it was normative for people in southern Canaan to push down into northern Egypt whenever the famine had to do with drought and rainfall. So that's what happens to the Israelites. That's why they're there. And it seems things are going well for them, right? They have increased and multiplied. And those of you who were on the women's retreat with me, recall, we studied the text if you were at the women's Passover celebration like 4 or 5 years ago, we talked about how it is that they multiplied so much. What was going on that the Israelites were so fertile? Anybody remember what the Midrash says? All right. We'll talk. We'll see if we talk about it. Yes, and I'm so panicked about what am I going to do? Like, I've already covered this text with them. What am I going to do next? Clearly, I can do it again. I don't have to worry. Thank you, Laura Diamond. The mirrors, absolutely. Let us deal shrewdly with them so that they may not increase. So who's Pharaoh talking to? He's chief of staff. So it seems Pharaoh wants buy-in from some of his closest, his cabinet. He wants support from his cabinet for what he's about to do, because it's pretty brutal. We brush over this because we know it so well, but if we try to confront this text as just a story we're hearing for the first time and really put ourselves in it, put yourself in Nazi Germany, right? It's that kind of stakes here, right? This is genocide that's about to happen, right? So he needs buy-in, because what he's about to do is pretty radical. What Pharaoh's about to decree, right? So they set taskmasters over them to oppress him with forced labor, and they built garrison cities for Pharaoh, Pitom and Ramses. But the more they were pressed, the more they increased and spread out, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. Again, it's hard to pinpoint exactly where Pitom is. In Egyptian, Pitim is the house of Atum. So Pitom, right, the house of Atum, one of the gods of Egypt.
When it says they built garrisons, is they the Israelites?
Yes. So this is conscription?
Forced labor.
It's forced labor, which is not unknown in the ancient world. If you want to build garrison cities, if you want to build the pyramids, if you want to build a huge something or other, you have to conscript labor to get that done, right? You're not going to pay regular laborers to do something like that. If you rule absolutely, you're going to conscript the people into service, into civil service. So in this case, it's forced labor for a part of the population, for the Hebrews. One of the first places we see this term, if you look at verse 9, Vayomer El Amo, he says to his people, this is Paro, Hine Am B'nai Yisrael, Rav. This is a interesting term. Am B'nai Yisrael. We don't see this other places. It's a unique phrase here. So usually we see Am Yisrael, right? That we're an Am, we're a nation. But Am B'nai Yisrael, the nation of the descendants of Israel, is a unique term. Which would be Beit Yisrael. That would be Beit Yisrael. So Am B'nai Yisrael is an interesting phrase, but this is the first time we're called B'nai Yisrael. The first time we are called the people Israel is by our enemy. Right? So it doesn't go unnoted by many scholars that who is a Jew is determined often by the enemy. Who has the right to return to the land of Israel as a Jew? Well, how's that definition come? What's the definition of a Jew? Anyone that Hitler would have murdered. That's who's a Jew.
Well, but that's not the case in Israel now.
If you would have been murdered by Hitler, you have the right to return.
Yes. Right, but for example, converts can't go unless they are Orthodox converts. That's not true anymore?
Not true anymore. The Israel Movement for Progressive Judaism now represents all converts and contacts the rabbi in America and then declares that our converts...
Fairly recent.
It was a Supreme Court decision. It was in the civil courts that decision was made. So you got to love Israel, right? There's no separation of church and state in Israel, right? So the Orthodox have control over all the portfolios having to do with religious matters. And sometimes if you want to change those, you go to the civil courts and sue in a civil court that my civil rights are being
Change, Amy, do you remember? Fairly recent. I mean, within the last...
I was still in Duluth. Yeah, I was still in Duluth. So it's at least 7 years ago.
I was told I had to have an Orthodox conversion or I could never...
It was once upon a time.
So they can come to Israel, they're welcome to come, however, are they recognized as Jewish?
Yes. The Israel Movement for Progressive Judaism, their rabbis stamp somebody's conversion as kasher, and they get Jew on their identity card, having contacted a rabbi in good standing here in the States who will vouch that they did the conversion.
The other piece here is that the creation of a people sometimes is that they share a history of suffering.
Indeed.
There's other examples today. We talk about the Palestinian people. You know, for some people that's a cultural group that was born of a common history.
Right. And often of suffering. Carol?
So if people who would have been murdered in the Holocaust or would be considered Jews are allowed to go to Israel, would that include gypsies?
If they have a Jewish grandparent.
Oh, if they have, okay.
That's who would have been murdered. As a Jew. You have to have been, if Hitler would have murdered you as a Jew, you have the right to return as a Jew.
Okay, I thought it was just gypsies in general that he also...
No.
But they're not Jewish.
No, I know that.
Right. So what? So
She's not saying if Hitler would have murdered you generally.
Yes, that's what I'm saying.
no.
Because you were Jewish.
So let me say it again. Who's a Jew? Who is a Jew for the right of return is defined by who Hitler would have murdered. As a Jew. Exactly. So my point being, who is a Jew by the state of Israel is still being defined by Hitler, the enemy. Exactly.
I think what this is also saying is that the Jews actually the Israelites define themselves because it's clear that they never assimilated into Egyptian society, which is why they were always thought of as somehow the other.
Right. So they remain other. And part of that, I know the rabbis love to lift up that they were so committed to the ways of their forefathers that they never assimilated. But the reality would have been in the ancient world, in ancient Egypt, Semites were discriminated against by the Egyptians. They couldn't assimilate because they were Semites, and Egyptians wouldn't eat with Semites. Right? That's why Joseph doesn't eat with his brothers. Because Egyptians would not have, it would have been disgusting to them to eat with Semites. So,
and that's also one of the reasons I understand that kashrut was established to keep us from eating with other people.
Correct. So the same way that the Egyptians didn't eat with others, that's what kashrut was to do, was to keep us separate, right? And because when you eat with people, it's a very intimate thing, and you socialize, and that leads to dancing. So don't lunch with people like the Jew, right? But you don't want to dance with. All right. So let's go to 13.
The Egyptians ruthlessly imposed upon the Israelites the various labors that they made them perform. Ruthlessly, they made life bitter for them, with harsh labor at mortar and bricks, and with all sorts of tasks in the field. The king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah, and the other Puah, saying, when you deliver the Hebrew women, look at the birth stool. If it is a boy, kill him. If it is a girl, let her live. The midwives, fearing God, did not do as the king of Egypt had told them. They let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, why have you done this thing, letting the boys live? The midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women. They are vigorous. Before the midwife can come to them, they have given birth. And God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and increased greatly. And because the midwives feared God, he established households for them. Then Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, every boy that is born you shall throw into the Nile, but let every girl live.
All right. So we have Shiphrah and Puah. We are told, right, that the king of Egypt spoke to Miyaldot Ha'ivriot. What is a Miyaledet? What are the Miyaldot? Midwives. What is Ha'ivriot?
Of the Hebrews.
What does this mean? The midwives of the Hebrews. One possibility is that the midwives are Hebrews. How reliable would Hebrew midwives be being entrusted to kill Hebrew baby boys? Not terribly reliable necessarily, right? So that's an argument against they are Hebrew midwives. What is the other possibility? If they're not Hebrews, what's the other possibility with this? They're the midwives for the Hebrews, right? So if that's the case, what can we assume if there's only two of them? If it's the midwives for the Hebrews, really? That's a lot of people giving birth and only two midwives. So likely these are the two who are in charge of the midwives. And midwifery was situated in the part of society in the ancient world, and particularly in ancient Egypt, that was kind of the cross between the magical and the medical. Those were very related in the ancient world, right? Still is, says Sarah, right? So they have skills, and they have a high level of technical knowledge, right, that makes them powerful because they're dealing with life, right? Life and death. And in the ancient world, as it is in many places in the world still, infant mortality was extraordinarily high. So, and the woman's life was always at risk as well. So midwives were really dealing with life and death, both for baby and for mother, every single time they delivered.
And if you are a kind of person who becomes a midwife, you are really interested in preserving life and making it comfortable for the woman. That's what I've seen.
So it's a certain kind of people that are drawn to becoming midwives. Do I see a hand?
No,
You're just pointing at the rain?
Yeah,
We love the rain.
It doesn't mean that there was only two midwives. It just said there's a bunch of midwives and two of them were named this and that. I mean,
not just that they were named this and that.
Yeah.
Not just that they were named this and that. What just happened? What just happened?
The Hebrews were enslaved.
Verse 15.
They were called up to speak to.
They're summoned to come to Pharaoh. They're not just two midwives named this and that. Who's Pharaoh going to summon? The leaders. Pharaoh's going to summon who's in charge?
Head of the department.
The head of the department. Right? So likely, Shiphrah and Puah are the two who are in charge of all of the midwives who are supposed to be attending to the Hebrews, because the Hebrews are
Prolific.
And and they're supposed to be killing the baby boys. So Pharaoh was like, excuse me, right? Something is not happening according to plan. When you get summoned by Pharaoh because something's not happening that Pharaoh decreed, what do we expect is going to happen at the end of that visit? They're going to be a little lighter for heads, right? So likely these are powerful women who are respected in Egyptian society. Possibly Shifra are the ones in charge of all of what's supposed to be happening with this part of the population, and they have to explain why the Hebrew population is still increasing at this rate.
Do we know which god they were afraid of?
We do not, but we can assume that our author, right, when it says fears God, right, generally is talking about Yod Heh Vav Heh.
Isn't the word Elohim here?
Right. So is it their Elohim?
Oh.
Or, right? Or Elohim, capital E, right? But generally Torah means Yod Heh Vav Heh one, or if it's the E author, Elohim.
Creator is a God, so this must be our God.
So,
and they're not going to include a story this important if they're talking about another culture. This is about our culture.
About our culture?
Yeah, about the Hebrew culture. This is a story of our culture. So when they use God, they're speaking of the Hebrew God.
So that could be. That's one argument, that it's the Hebrew God. Is, well, duh, it's our story, so it must be our God. But I find it interesting that the heroes, the heroines, the first heroines of the book of Exodus, if we take the explanation we just agreed on, just play with it for a minute, are not Jews. They're not Hebrews. They're righteous Gentiles, right? They are not Hebrews, which I find fascinating.
You got this job because you have a great respect for life.
And
you're not going to be killing babies.
But certainly, what I love about this text is that our story, our mythic birth of a nation story, starts with the heroism of two non-Hebrew women who respected life. So the story's immediately telling us Torah understands. Even our ancestors writing these stories understood that in every culture there are people who are respectful of life, right? So I just love that about our foundation narrative, that it doesn't say, we unlike them, right? Which is what the midwives are going to use in just a minute, right? All right.
The inclusion here of not only righteous Gentiles, but enemies who have shaped our culture, I think is very enriching to all the stories.
Absolutely. So the question Hebrew or Egyptian, I love this quote. The rabbis are divided on this. Rashi declares the former, that they're Hebrews, but Abravanel and Samuel David Luzzatto say that they are Egyptians. Luzzatto reasons that this is because it would have been unreasonable for Pharaoh to think that the Hebrew women would have murdered their own people. Former Chief Rabbi of England, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, comments, the Torah's ambiguity on this point is deliberate. We do not know to which people they belonged because their particular form of moral courage transcends nationality and race.
It doesn't matter.
Love that it doesn't matter. That because that moral demand to not hurt innocent life is beyond nation or people or race or religion or anything that we can come up with. I love that. So he challenges the midwives, right? Saying, he's charged them with looking at the birth stool and if it's a boy, killing them, right? And when that doesn't happen, they're summoned. At verse 18, it says, why have you done this thing, letting the boys live? It's not a question, what's happening with the Israelites? Pharaoh knows the boys are not being murdered at the rate they should be. So he knows his orders have been defied. So his question is not, have you, but why have you? Right?
Why, if he wanted to commit genocide, would he kill the boys and not the girls?
We can presume a couple things. So I should maybe not have used genocide. He wants to limit the population of the
but if there's no
Hebrews.
Jewish women, then the Jewish men.
So you tell me.
I don't know.
Why are men more of a threat?
They're strong.
Oh, they're military.
So they are the real threat. What are women used for?
Birth.
And?
Pleasure.
Of course. So you have a slave population, the women are not.
But on the other hand, if they
are not a threat.
If they had killed the women, that would have basically forced the men either to be celibate or to join Egyptian society.
Or to become an army to take revenge on their women having been killed. I mean, so the threat seems to be, right, that the fear seems to be that there will be an insurrection against Pharaoh.
Or is there also the sense here that men matter and women don't?
That too. Absolutely that too. But presumably with no men, the women of Israel are not, the Hebrew women are not a threat.
Back as one of the plagues.
Oh yeah. Oh, for sure. It has to, right? It's not good literature if you don't have stuff like that coming back. Exactly right.
Is there maybe a suggestion that the women were being honest about, the reason is because they're too vigorous, Maybe they really did help them, but they just wanted to kind of gloss over the reason why they let the boys.
It's even better.
Yeah.
It's even better. So when their lives are on the line, when Pharaoh says, "Why have you done this? Why have you defied me?" essentially, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, say Shifra and Puah. They are vigorous. Is that what yours translation says? Yes, probably it's a decent translation. I'm not going to argue with JPS, God forbid. But what does the Hebrew say? Ha! Chayot. Rita Ephros.
They're animals.
Animals. They are animals, is what it says. Chayot, beasts. Right?
Give birth like that.
They're not like Egyptian women. These women are animals.
They're nasty.
They're just nasty.
Right.
Before the midwife can come to them, they have given birth. Meaning they just drop babies in the field and then go back to work. They're beasts. What have they just, and what does Pharaoh say? Right? Nothing. Right? And God dealt well with the midwives. Right? And the people multiplied and increased greatly, and because the midwives fear God, God established households for them. Pharaoh is completely silent here. Completely. But clearly, they lived, so he bought it. So what have they just done?
They saved us.
How? How?
They used his prejudice.
They used Pharaoh's own and the Egyptians' own prejudice against the Jewish people, against the Hebrews, to save themselves and to save these babies, right? These women are beasts. We can't even get there in time. They're not like Egyptian women, right? Well, of course they're exactly like Egyptian women, right? That is, I think, a beautiful move, right, on Torah's part, to say they outsmarted Paro using his own, right, prejudice against him. And they have established for themselves here by God households, right? We only see this with men in Torah. Men get households. Women get children. Men have households established through them. So Shifra and Puah become essentially ancestors, right? That's what it means to have, a household. It means you become the ancestor of that household. And so they
elevated them to men status.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And so this is the first case, the first recorded case, certainly in Torah, one of the earliest that we know of civil disobedience, right? Against a regime that was all powerful and against a despot that was all powerful. And it's these two midwives.
There's kind of a parallel with Abraham arguing with God over Sodom and Gomorrah in the sense that they are assuming that God is a moral God, that there's morality here. Because when it says that they feared God, that somehow they knew that this was wrong, and that God had to be just.
Right. Robin Cohen writes, and I'll be using this quote tonight. We have a speaker from JWW on the refugee crisis. Robin Cohen says, in our own time, I can imagine anti-immigration proponents quoting Pharaoh. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them. They have become a people numerous and powerful. The prejudices directed at the Hebrew people are the same as those that fall on the poor, foreigners, and refugees today. They have too many children. They are lazy. And someday they may dilute our own people so much that they could take advantage of a national crisis and, God forbid, gain control. Not only are Shifra and Puah models of how women bonding together can be freedom fighters against an oppressive system, but more generally the text moves beyond nationalistic concerns to bear witness to the power of faith to transcend ethnic boundaries. We have an opportunity in our own time to speak out against injustice, just as the midwives did thousands of years ago. And the midwives demonstrated it doesn't matter how few our numbers, each individual counts in the fight for justice and liberation. Right? An incredibly important message for us, that every individual counts in the fight against injustice and unjust policies. Every one of us. And it's very easy to lose sight of that. But Shifra and Puah, right, are the lesson. They're the reminder. And we're going to get more acts like this, yes, as we turn to chapter 2.
Wait, did the
Yes.
rabbis talk about why 2?
Why
not
2?
1?
No.
I mean, if it was going to be the head of the midwives,
I haven't ever seen any commentary about
you
why
would
2.
think, that there was like one head of the midwives.
Right. No, I've not seen that. Yes.
Yeah.
Why didn't Pharaoh just kill them all of the babies?
It's a good question. I don't know. What do y'all think?
Because they have no slaves.
Because what?
They have no slaves.
They'd have no slaves. So possibly wanting to keep part of the workforce. Right? Domestic servants. Right? Conscripted labor. But not so many that they could be an actual threat to the regime. Possibly they couldn't get away with that. Right? Hitler even didn't publicize what he was doing. Right? Like, just sometimes there's just you go too far. Right? You think this is pretty far? To kill all the baby boys? Margot?
The fact that the Jewish child is born of a Jewish mother, which is kind of passed down from ages to ages.
That's very late.
Very late.
Very late.
Yes.
Very late. Here, it would have been by the man. And there was no Jewish. Back here, there was no Jewish. You were Hebrew. And later, Israelite. And Israelite identity and tribal identity went by the father. We know there's the culture that predates this is matrilocal and matrilineal. It would have gone by the mother, but by the time the Torah is written, it's already patriarchy.
So how late? You say that happened very late.
I'm not sure exactly when the rabbinic edict happened, but it was the rabbis who did it. And it was a kindness to women. Because when you had pogroms and you had invasion of Jewish villages, you couldn't be sure whose child it was because women were raped. Routinely, they were raped. So if you're raped and you don't know who the father is, possibly your child is a mamzer, right? He's a bastard. And if you have a bastard, they can't marry within the Jewish community. So it was actually a kindness to women that the rabbis ruled that whether or not a child is Jewish is based on the mother's identity, not the father's identity. So that there would never be a question that a child born of a Jewish mother was not Jewish and therefore couldn't marry with, the mamzer status, I misspoke. Mamzer is someone who's outside of wedlock. So that still could be the case. But a non-Jewish baby, if like she was raped by a Cossack or whatever, then, it's not that late, but that baby wouldn't be Jewish and therefore couldn't marry within the community.
It would be ostracized.
It would be ostracized. And imagine what that would do to the mother who's already been traumatized. So that was why Jewish identity went through the mother. Now within progressive Judaism, however, the Reform movement was the first to make a really big issue out of to make an issue out of patrilineal descent, right? That if your father was Jewish and you're raised Jewish, you're Jewish, according to the Reform movement. We call it in the Reconstructionist movement egalitarian descent. That whoever your Jewish parent is. If you're raised Jewish, you are considered a Jew within the Reconstructionist movement. And we just, at one convention years ago, maybe like 5 years ago, had a very interesting rabbinic debate because so many people are now hiring surrogates to have babies, particularly in the Jewish world, because we are more educated and generally more wealthy. And so we wait later to have children, and that's when you have a lot of infertility issues. So in the Jewish community, there's a lot more use of assistive technologies to help women become pregnant. So that often means you have an egg donor and a sperm donor. So if you have an egg donor and a sperm donor, or it's my egg and it's carried by a surrogate, how is Jewish identity determined now? And we had a huge debate that was very impassioned. It got very heated. It did get heated, but it was more about like it touched off so much stuff for the people who had adopted, for people who had carried children from an egg donor, from people who'd given their egg to be put in another rabbis in the room. We all had all of these circumstances, right? I had a donor to have my child. Like all of us in the room arguing this had skin in the game. This was not an intellectual conversation. This got really, really pointed. So much so that one of my colleagues was in tears, who had adopted a daughter from Colombia. And she said, why, if there's an egg donor and a sperm donor, why is that baby Jewish because it's put in your uterus, but mine isn't? We should stop all of this. And all babies who are raised by Jews should be Jewish, period. Why does my child have to go to mikvah? And yours that doesn't have any Jewish anything doesn't have to because the sperm was Jewish. Like, what does that even mean? My daughter doesn't know anything else. Why do I have to take her? Why does she have to be a convert? Not that there's anything wrong with convert, but it was like it was very interesting to see where the lines, like what the arguments were on all sides. And the decision became, if any part of the baby is Jewish, whether it be womb, egg, or sperm, the baby is Jewish. The adoption goes to mikvah and has a conversion.
You said that the Reform movement said if the father is Jewish and the child is raised Jewish, what does child raised Jewish mean in that context?
Not raised in another tradition.
Okay, just not raised, but it could be raised secular. Or just without. So you can have a Jewish father in a home that has no religion.
In other words, but if you didn't grow up with any reference to Judaism at all, there's some question about whether or not that person needs to make a public statement about, I now choose to be part of the Jewish people, right? In other words, if you just find out on Ancestry.com that your father, your birth father, your biological father is Jewish, but you were not raised with any sense of belonging to the Jewish people, most people, including me, would recommend conversion. Or some kind of public ritual to say, I am claiming my Jewish identity, because it's an important step. Like if you haven't grown up with that, to all of a sudden say, I found out, my bio father was Jewish, so I'm now Jewish. It's like, what does that mean?
Of a mother?
So I think so. If you find out that your birth mother was Jewish and you've not been raised Jewish, I would want some kind of way to mark that for people, that they're now choosing to be part of the Jewish people.
So that is not a racial definition of Jew.
That is a whole other conversation that I'm not prepared to have. I've just started reading someone who recently died with no family, was very much into reading from all traditions, and his best friend, who was with him as he died because he had nobody else, is a member of KI, and asked that Chaim and I come see him in the hospital, which we did as he was dying. And so she brought me a bunch of his books when he died recently, and like 3 or 4 of them were on race and Jewish identity. So, and one of them's on blood. Judaism and blood, like as the relationship in Torah, which you'll be hearing about when we get to Leviticus, if I can read fast enough. It's very interesting, but this whole question of race, one thing I didn't realize until I started reading these books is that that most scholars agree these days, apparently, there is no such thing as race.
Yeah, please, thank you.
That it's a construct, and that race is irrelevant. Everybody's a mixture. and that race itself, I didn't know that. Race itself is now understood to be irrelevant. It's not even accurate to say race. So so I think for sure what Sarah's lifting up is a person's choice, right? How we identify is choice. However, for most of Jewish history, it wasn't a choice, really. You were born a Jew and you were treated as a Jew, and unless you converted to another religion, you were stuck. Right? You couldn't leave. There was no secular identity. All identity was religious. And so if you were either, obviously I'll date when I'm talking about, you either Christian, or Muslim, or Jewish, if we're talking about Europe, for example, right? So there wasn't an option not to be part of the Jewish people unless you converted to something else. Now we like to say every Jew is a Jew by choice.
In the long run, it didn't make any difference in Europe what your tradition was or somewhere else.
Or what your choice was, right? In Europe, the choice was made for you by Hitler, right? Whether you identified or not, which is one of the deep ironies of those Jews who assimilated completely in Europe, completely assimilated, and were murdered right along with people wearing payas.
We were talking about conversion and choice and all of this, but I think an adoption of an infant is interesting because traditionally that child had to be converted as well.
Of course, and still is. Every child adopted now by a Jewish family that's not Jewish is still converted.
Is it right? Okay.
Yes. Yes.
I remember that from 40 years ago. But
Yep, absolutely. All right, let's go to chapter 2, speaking of adoption.
A certain man of the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw how beautiful he was, she hid him for 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she got a wicker basket for him and caulked it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child into it and placed it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. And his sister stationed herself at a distance to learn what would befall him. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe in the Nile, while her maidens walked along the Nile. She spied the basket among the reeds and sent her slave girl to fetch it. When she opened it, she saw that it was a child, a boy, crying. She took pity on it and said, "This must be a Hebrew child." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get you a Hebrew nurse to suckle the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter answered, "Yes." So the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child and nurse it for me, and I will pay your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed it. When the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, who made him her son. She named him Moses, explaining, "I drew him out of the water."
All right. We're gonna obviously need to move through this at a little bit of a clip. But I want to draw your attention to our YouTube channel, because each one of these characters I have done a full, almost hour teaching on for the Women's Passover celebration every year. So it's very hard for me to move through this material quickly, because there's so much here on Batya, on Pharaoh's daughter, on Miriam, on Yocheved, Moses' mother. On every one of them, I've done a whole hour. It's an incredibly powerful and moving story. So forgive me that we're not going to be able to go as deep as I would like. All right, so we have a man of the house of Levi. Why Levi? Exactly, has to be. Because who's coming from this union? Moshe. Moshe has to be a Levite. Has to. All right. So a man of Levi went and married a woman of Levi. The woman conceived and bore a son. And what happens when she sees her son?
She saw how beautiful he was.
Vate re'oto. What? Did everyone's translation say beautiful?
This is beautiful.
Rita Ephros. Kitov.
It was Kitov.
Creation. Thank you.
Yeah.
She gives birth. She sees her child. Kitov. What are we told every single day of creation? God says, Tov. It is good. This is exactly, we are in the beginning of the book of Exodus, and we are being pulled all the way back to the beginning of the book of Genesis. This is creation. Kitov.
So
the child was good.
Well, beautiful then is a very bad translation, because it means physical physically handsome or...
And possibly that's how that euphemism is used, about children, that tov means beautiful. I'm not going to argue with their scholars, but I think you lose for sure with that translation. You lose the resonance of ki tov. What that means, that she sees this, like all creation, whenever we create, right? We look at that miracle and we say ki tov. It's exactly what God says when God creates the universe. That is what the mother says when she holds her infant, ki tov, right? Until they start yowling. And then I was just like, someone do something with them. So she hides him. What's she supposed to do with him? If it's a boy, he's supposed to be killed. He's supposed to be drowned in the Nile. So she hides him for 3 months when she could hide him no longer. So imagine that moment for Yocheved. She can't hide him any longer. He's too big. He's making too much noise. He's squirming too much. We don't know. Maybe they count the months when a woman gets pregnant and log it, and she could go 3 months and hide her pregnancy, but now they have a record that surely there's a baby somewhere at this point, right? So she bought herself 3 months maybe, but she can't hide him anymore.
What happens with circumcision?
In what case?
Well, Moses, before.
So this is before they are commanded to circumcise. How do we know that? What happens later in the book of Exodus? Moses is circumcised as an adult. He's circumcised, and then his sons, right? So remind me, I don't know if it's this year in the triennial or not, but the bridegroom of blood, do you remember that text? With the foreskin and the leg and the flint knife and Sipporah and right? So that's how we know he's not circumcised here. All right, so...
There's no mention of Aaron, of his older brother.
Right, correct. So when she could hide him no longer, what does she get? She gets a... What's the word used in Hebrew? Such a great text, I'm telling you guys. She gets a teva. Where's the only other place we see teva? Oh, yeah. Oh, that story. Back in Genesis, we have a teva. We have an ark. And in the ark is placed life that's in danger of being destroyed. And it's put in the water. And it floats. And God takes care of it. And life is saved. And the world is repopulated, right? Okay, you cannot read this story without that story here.
Actually, I just saw a National Geographic show, and they made an ark which was a basket. It was round, and they did it with reeds, like that, and they used bitumen or
pitch,
stuff like that. It was just on about last month. And they made this gigantic round basket, and they said, "Oh, the ark, maybe it was round." So it's amazing that you just made that connection.
Right? Yeah. So she's right now the third woman to defy Pharaoh's orders. She's risking her life and presumably the life of her family with this infant that she now can't keep because he'll be killed. So imagine this moment for Moses' mother. She creates a teva. She creates an ark that can't be steered, right? It's going to be left up to fortune what's going to happen. And she waterproofs it and puts the baby in there and pushes it down the Nile. So it's so beautiful. She takes the baby that's supposed to be put in the Nile and puts him in the Nile, right? It's this wonderful deliverance of the baby. To save his life, she puts him in the Nile that's supposed to take his life, not knowing, right, whether it will or it won't take his life. So she places him in the basket or in the teva, and she puts it in the reeds by the bank of the Nile. And his sister stationed herself at a distance to learn what would befall him. So knowing that the teva is going to be directed by the current by God, by whatever. It can't be steered. There's nothing they can do.
The reeds are safer than putting him out in the middle.
So the reeds presumably are a little safer. But Miriam, I just love this. It doesn't mean you don't do anything. Yes, you maybe can't steer it and you can't govern the outcome of it, but it doesn't mean you abdicate all responsibility. Miriam stations herself as a witness. If nothing else, she can witness. And we see that Miriam is another one of the women who intervenes and saves Moshe's life. She intervenes in a way that saves his life. So we think there's nothing we can do. Yocheved knows she can't do anything. Miriam thinks she can't do anything, but we don't abandon our responsibility to witness, to watch, and to wait for a moment that we can do something, right?
And she puts them in reeds, suf.
She does.
Later, that is the Yam Suf, the Sea of Reeds, is where the Israelites get rescued.
Correct.
Why aren't their names given?
Very interesting. Why do you think that is, Sheldon, that we don't get a name here?
I guess to make it general.
And what is the point of making it general?
Sorry, I said that.
Sorry you opened your mouth now, aren't you?
It's not about Moshe's ancestry. It's not, he didn't inherit his position.
So we know he's a Levite, so that seems to be important. There is a part of his ancestry that seems important. But so it seems it isn't about a specific person. It's about every one of us, right? That every mother, every sister, in this case, but that.
Even given that, the baby was already at least 3 months old. Might not he went 3 months without any kind of a name, or just for regard?
It's a wonderful question. We don't even get Moshe's name. He's not named here. He's going to be named by Pharaoh's daughter. So did he have a Hebrew name? We don't know. We don't know if he went for 3 months without a name.
On the other hand, they may not want to identify him, even if he was known by something.
We have no idea what happened in those 3 months. Absolutely no idea.
This was before baby naming.
It was.
Have the effect of making Moses the youngest child.
He is the youngest.
So at the time, the other younger sons were chosen over the older sons.
In our case, older sons were chosen over younger sons. I mean, in the Torah. Let me rephrase. It's supposed to be that the older son gets everything, and if the younger son gets it, it's by.
The younger son, in fact, is chosen.
Okay, but that's not the Israelite tradition, is my point. That was not an Israelite tradition. Correct. Jacob tricked his older brother out of the birthright and then tricked his father to give him the blessing of the firstborn. And that's what I was saying. In every case, it's supposed to be that the oldest child gets it. And in every case in our story, the younger one does something to manipulate it.
But in some sense, the story of Moses validates the notion that Moses is the youngest. Miriam's older.
So it depends whether you consider what happens to Moshe a reward. I'm not even being facetious. Moshe didn't have an easy life, right? And Aaron becomes high priest. So Aaron, who's older, becomes high priest, and his sons become the priests after him. The priestly line is going to go through Aaron. Moshe's the prophet, right? And so it depends which one won. Who got the better deal? That would be an interesting conversation, right? Who actually got the better deal in that one? I think Moshe would argue Aaron got the better deal. All right, so where are we?
Something very confusing here. I think you're getting there.
Yeah. Hopefully, verse 5, right?
Yeah, well, okay.
Paro's daughter.
7, right? Keep on going.
Paro's daughter comes down to bathe in the Nile. While her maidens walked along the Nile, she spied the basket among the reeds and sent her slave girl to fetch it. Yes, then there's the whole beautiful midrash about she couldn't reach it, so don't read. She sent her slave Amma, but Amma is an Aramaic word for arm. Rather, she couldn't reach it, but she sent her arm out, and God created a miracle that extended her arm and made it long, what was that superhero that is Gumby, like stretches, Rubber Man, whatever it is.
Spider-Man.
No, the one who has the arm, Rubber Man or whatever it is, whose arms become as long as he needs them to. So her arm becomes super, 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 super long, and she's able to draw the teva in. Again, I think the reason for these midrashim are all about it saying it looks impossible. It seems impossible. It's very clear what's going to happen, and it's doomsday for Moshe. And in every case, because women were vigilant to say, I don't know, and I can't reach it, so a lot of people don't reach. But the answer is, the daughter of Paro in that midrash reaches anyway. And it's only because she reaches that the miracle can happen that extends her arm all the way out into the Nile, right?
That's why we're having the Women's March.
And a few good men. And a few good men. When she opened it, she saw that it was a child, a boy, crying. And what happens in that moment that she sees this child and she hears it crying? Vatachmol alav. She experiences chemla. She experiences compassion. I mean, it's not a great translation, but she experiences something that moves her and takes pity on this child. She took pity on it, and that's how they're translating chemla as pity. It's not a great word. Mercy is better, but rachamim is mercy, and this isn't really that. But it's related to mercy, compassion. And she says, Batomer, this must be a Hebrew child. How? Why? It's in the river. So only a Hebrew child will be put in the river?
Was their dress different? What did that be? With the child?
Poor Egyptian women. Poor Egyptian women, abandoning infants was a common form of birth control. It still is. You abandon an infant, you expose it, and it dies, and you're done. So, everywhere in the world, our financial and HR director just adopted a baby from Colombia, this beautiful, beautiful baby boy with these huge blue eyes and curly light hair, who was found in a garbage can. That they punched holes in the side of a garbage can, threw it in there, and put a lid on it. The exposure is a way that if you can't afford birth control, you deal with reproduction. So possibly poor Egyptian women expose their babies as well. Is it because it's not exposed, Dafka? Because such care has been taken to try to shield him? That she feels like it's not an Egyptian baby, but a Hebrew mother that's trying to do something? Possibly. Are they swaddled differently? Are Hebrew baby boys swaddled differently than Egyptian babies? Is there something about the cloth that's in the... she doesn't know anything about Miriam yet at this moment. So...
Wouldn't it argue the fact that she says that? It must be Hebrew maybe mean that people aren't doing that just because,
No.
Well, how would she know?
It could. So what I also love about this story is that for Yocheved to do what she does, she's counting on chemla. Yocheved is counting on somebody's chemla. That somebody is going to feel rachmanas for this child. So, and for it to work, it needs to be the enemy. Right? If a Hebrew finds the baby and takes pity on it, so what? Its life is still forfeit, right? For this to work, she's counting on the enemy feeling compassion for a baby.
Where the woman bathes and she puts it.
An excellent question, Judith. So possibly she knows Bat Paro comes down to the Nile to bathe, and she places that baby and stations Miriam exactly where she knows he's likely to be discovered by Egyptian royalty. But what might one assume the daughter of the most powerful man in the world who was worshipped in his country as a god, what do we assume she would do if she found a Hebrew baby? To count on the enemy's daughter to not turn in a baby boy, to defy her godfather's to defy her father who's a god, right? Come on. Like, who would count on that?
It's like leaving a Jewish baby on Ava Braun's doorstep.
Right? Who would possibly count on
somebody who had teenagers?
Somebody who had teenagers might count on that. All right.
Why do you say count and not hope? Why do you say count on instead of hope for?
Because, I mean, I think she hoped, but what she's banking everything on by putting him in that basket, she's banking on somebody on the other side. There's other things she could have done, presumably. I don't know what, but our story is, and this is what I love about this story, is that she counts on that baby being found by the enemy, and someone who's the enemy taking pity on her son.
We don't know anything about
it's extraordinary.
Well, maybe they knew Ivanka used to be a Democrat.
Just saying. Sarah?
I know somebody who's a child survivor who was put on church steps in Poland by her Jewish father so that she could be saved by Christians.
He counted on chemla. That someone in that church would have chemla on that baby. The only difference, and I'm not saying it's radically different, but I just want to lift up one difference, is she didn't leave it at Nazi headquarters. In other words, you might assume that in a church, the people who work in a church and give their lives to God might have a propensity to, even if it's a Hebrew child, rescue it. I mean, I get it. It's still dangerous and it's still huge and it's still wonderful. In this case, Yocheved is counting on a Nazi, right? Someone from the other side who's gonna, and not only on the other side, who's closest to the hall of power, who is close to the seat of power. This is the palace, right? If it's intentional that it's Batya that it's the daughter of Pharaoh that's gonna find it, then she's putting him right at the of power, the place you would least expect.
Maybe that's the only
Chemla.
that her father would forgive Ivanka. Really,
right?
Is there any significance that right before this we've learned of the two midwives who also saved the children?
I think there's significance to every single woman in this story. And I think it's significant that it's women who saved Moshe. Right? In an age and a time where women were so disempowered, I find it remarkable that our foundation narrative is about women defying the power systems of the time that allows Moshe to become the deliverer, through God, of course, of the Jewish people. I find it extraordinary, actually. And we read it all the time and we know it and we just take it for granted. I just wanted to bust it open for us a little to say, there's nothing about this that should be here. Right? If you're writing a foundational narrative in a patriarchal society, this shouldn't be the way the story goes. And
part of this because we don't know the background of the Pharaoh's daughter more than that's who she is. There's a mystical element here too that supports the theory that women are the ones who have saved the heroes finally.
Yep. Absolutely.
Maybe it has also to do with the same reason why it was the boys who were chosen. So the women can be the ones to save Moses because they are the less threatening of the two, men and women. So men couldn't do it because they would pose a threat.
They have more risk too.
And the women, they're not threatening. So it's they who have the ability to kind of guide.
Okay.
Women are the enemies of the power.
So I want Chemla is the enemy of power, right? And we ask God, Chamalta Aleinu, you've had compassion on us, meaning we didn't earn it, right? And I think that's the moral here. The midwives, Miriam, Yocheved, the daughter of Pharaoh. It's all about Chemla. It's about taking this innocent, perfect life and feeling chemla, feeling compassion. That is always the enemy of power. Always. Tenderness, the heart opening is the enemy of power. There's cracks at the highest seat of the strongest, mightiest, scariest ruler in the world, and that crack is opened by compassion. and by love and by tenderness. And it wins the day in our story. And it wins eventually, every time.
Yeah, and the fact is the Pharaoh had a mother, so, right?
Presumably. Presumably. All right, let's just close this out. This must be a Hebrew child. Imagine the scene. Batya takes the child out of the thing and says, it's a Hebrew child. Okay. Everybody now knows this is a Hebrew child, right? She's just said it out loud in front of witnesses. What does Miriam do at this moment? Brilliant. What does Miriam do? Shall I go get you a Hebrew nurse to suckle the child for you? What has she just done?
Keep it alive.
She's just made Pharaoh's daughter somebody who's going to keep the baby. Right? Oh, what a cute little puppy. Let me go get you some food for it. Right? Like it's yours now, right? And so this brilliant move by Miriam, who is a slave girl to address Pharaoh's daughter? Possibly Miriam is taking her own life into her hands right here.
She's offering to help, which is a good subterfuge.
But to address the daughter of the king as a slave girl, like this is a moment of incredible, we can imagine, courage and bravery and chutzpah, right? We come from chutzpahdik mythic ancestors. So she speaks to Pharaoh's daughter, and not only speaks, but saves his life by suggesting she's going to keep the baby. And Pharaoh's daughter answered, yes. So in that moment, his life is spared. So the girl went and called the child's mother.
Who was her mother, too.
So she knows who the mother is, right? The omniscient author, and we know that. Presumably, obviously, Pharaoh's daughter doesn't know that it's the mother. She just knows it's a wet nurse. But imagine for Yocheved that Miriam comes and says, here's the baby, and Pharaoh's daughter is going to adopt him, and you are going to feed him until then.
And then here's the mother who didn't kill the baby, who was supposed to.
But daughter Pharaoh doesn't know that. Does not know that. No, to the omniscient author, it's clear. Nothing is said to Pharaoh's daughter.
Just a wet nurse.
Oh, that was just a wet.
For Pharaoh's daughter, she could just be a wet nurse. We, from the omniscient narrator, know that it's the boy's mother, but she doesn't know that. So
keep him till he grows up. What is that? Grows up.
So in the ancient world, they nursed until about the age of 3 or 4. So probably one of the reasons, that's probably one of the ways, right, babies were spaced out, was that you nursed until the child got different teeth, and even past that, right? So if you talk about every 4 years, right, you're nursing for 4 years at a time. It makes sense, and it appears what it means here is that till he's weaned, right? She's gonna nurse him until he no longer needs a wet nurse, and that is what happens. So Yocheved is paid to nurse her own son, knowing she's not going to raise this child. Right? I can't quite imagine what that is for Yocheved. When the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, who made him her son. So she weans Moshe, and she brings him to the palace to turn him over to the princess to be raised in the hall of the enemy.
Is there any talk about during those years of the princess and Yocheved having any kind of contact, or did she ever have contact with the child?
We have nothing. We know nothing. There's some midrash, but not a lot about this period. So we know nothing other than we know that must be. I can't imagine what it is to nurse your own son that you know you're going to have to give over to be raised not only in the house of the enemy, but at the headquarters, of the enemy.
But she had given up the child and thought she'd never see it again.
Okay, so you're nursing your child knowing you're going to have him raised in the headquarters of Nazi Germany. And women did it. Look, women and men did it all the time. I'm not suggesting it's worse than the other option. I'm saying if we look behind just the words here, it's a wrenching story on every level for everybody involved.
She's giving him trust. He becomes a trustful, loving child through that nurturing that he's getting from her, and he has more possibility of surviving in this hostile environment afterwards.
Elena, loving the rose-colored glasses. Love that. Love that. Beautiful. Beautifully said. Beautifully envisioned.
That is so traumatic for Moses at 3 or 4. How is that played out in the rest of the Bible?
The only thing I can imagine is that he would have been like every other wealthy child of nobility and of royalty, that you're raised by the nanny. You're not. You don't suckle at your mother's breast if your mother's the daughter of Pharaoh. You know what I mean? But an interesting thing would be to ask, how exactly? So at 4 years old, he shows up on the doorstep. Take 2 pages, and all of a sudden she has a son. What does she say to Pharaoh? Dad? There's something I forgot to tell. She's not been pregnant. She's had no pregnancy. She's not married that we know of. How does she explain at 3 years old she has a son that she's going to present to Paro? Right? Somebody, Laura, you'll get working on writing that midrash. Yes?
Yeah.
She's privileged.
She's privileged.
It's 2, right?
She has that.
Oh, you did.
How does Moses know he's Hebrew?
So that's a very good question. We don't know that Moses knows he's Hebrew. The omniscient author, narrator, knows he's a Hebrew. We don't know that he knows he's a Hebrew. Because it says when he goes out, he sees one of his kinsmen. We know that it's one of his kinsmen. We don't know that Moses knows that. Correct. Which I also talked about a lot in one of my talks. Because does he know? It changes the story if he knows he's a Hebrew or he doesn't know he's a Hebrew. I prefer that he doesn't know he's a Hebrew. What he's reacting to is the violence of the taskmaster, and he acts out of compassion for the Hebrew, not because it's one of his own, right? But we don't know. So look at bringing down the empire. This second paragraph, this part of our story is an ancient observation about the vulnerabilities of absolute power structures in human societies. Even if they are seemingly invincible, these power structures have cracks at them, even at the highest levels. Poor Yocheved, baby Moses' biological mother, acted on the hope that this crack was part of reality. It was a desperate act. She dared to have faith that there was something more to the world than raw power and callousness. She cast her condemned son upon the waters of the Nile, the symbol of the life of all Egypt, in the hope that someone somewhere in this empire of cruelty might feel a stirring of sympathy and choose to rescue the child. So what I said before, beautifully stated here by Maurice Harris, right? So really, really about, as Fran said, about hope and the goodness of humanity, even though it seems it's all about, right, power and callousness. And the other thing I love is that in every way Moshe is other, right? So he's born to these slaves. We don't know if he knows he's a Hebrew, but he is a Hebrew being raised in Pharaoh's house, right? And so this is Maurice Harris again. It's in parentheses for you at the bottom. The selfless women in Moses' young life give birth to the independence of mind that will allow him to assume his role as leader. From them, Moses learns to examine the norms and values of his environment and to reject the corruption he sees among Egyptian and Israelite alike. The daughters in this narrative lead Moses to an awareness of his otherness and ultimately to a discovery of the heroism needed to conceive of and carry out the move to redemption. He's not raised as a Hebrew. He's raised as a royal Egyptian. Right? So he's going to become the leader of our people, and it's critical, Maurice Harris suggests, that he's other, that he's an outsider, that he's not raised, that he's not going to do what he's going to do in the culture he's raised in. Right? So he needs the status of other in order to help him think independently and to challenge the norms and values of Egyptian society. His otherness was a key factor in challenging the norms of his society and adoptive status. Those of us who have felt like the other bring this very quality to the Jewish community or any community we become a part of. Look at the next page. Does it start with we need both the identities we're born with? Right? So he's born as a Hebrew, but he becomes an Egyptian royal. Tyrants like Pharaoh have the power to name things, and they count on the names of things remaining stable, like the other objects of their control. What they can't control, however, is something the Torah shows us in this story. The unexpected events of our lives can change us utterly, even changing our names, renaming us into members of a counterforce to the system of oppression. Right? Beautifully stated by Maurice Harris. And his book, all my quotes are from his book called Moses, A Stranger Among Us. And he talks about the fact that Moshe is a stranger, like in every single way. Like he's exiled, so he's not. He doesn't even stay within that culture. He's the consummate other. He marries a non-Jew. He marries the daughter of the high priest of Midian. He's raised as a non-Hebrew, right? And by Batya, who's his adoptive mother. He's not raised in his birth family, right? So there's, on every level, Moshe is an outsider. He's different. He's a stranger. And talking about this moment with Pharaoh's daughter, in the brief moment described in this verse, the daughter of the most powerful emperor in the world stood face to face with an abandoned Hebrew baby boy, condemned to die by her father's order. The seed of the overthrow of 4 centuries of slavery was planted. In the time it took for one young woman's heart to feel a pulse of compassion strong enough to evoke action, the gods of Egypt fell, and the God of Israel entered the drama of history and the world's stage as the champion of the oppressed. The revolution was born in the most unlikely of places, inside his unnamed daughter's heart. And I will close with, on page, it's a circle 3 on your top right corner, hopefully. Yes? You see the orange? Yes. So going back to the word chayot, animals, the root of chayot is what?
Life.
Chai. Life. Right? So they not only won't kill, right, the Hebrew women, but they are chayot. They are life givers. Right? They are people who are attached to creating and sustaining life. The significance of this story is that it is the first recorded instance of one of Judaism's greatest contributions to civilization. The idea that there are moral limits to power. There are instructions that should not be obeyed. There are crimes against humanity that cannot be excused by the claim, I was only obeying orders. This concept, generally known as civil disobedience, is usually attributed to the 19th century American writer Henry David Thoreau and entered international consciousness after the Holocaust and the Nuremberg trials. Its true origin, though, lay thousands of years earlier in the actions of 2 women, Shifra and Puah. Through their understated courage, they earned a high place among the moral heroes of history, teaching us the primacy of conscience over conformity, the law of justice over the law of the land. Shifra and Puah, by refusing to obey an immoral order, redefined the moral imagination of the world.
You've been listening to Rabbi Amy Bernstein's Friday morning Torah study from Kehillat Israel in Pacific Palisades, California. For more information, go to our website, www.ourki.org.